Evening, everyone. Welcome to the next installment of our studies of our new series for the year. Hopefully, we will learn from the wisdom and insights of Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg in the course of this cycle of the Torah reading. Last week, we started with Parasha, and we're up to Noach already. Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg's famous commentary is known as ha-Ketav, ve-ha-Kabbalah, which we can render as the text and the tradition. And his orientation and his objective is to demonstrate the interrelationship and the unity that underlies the written Torah and the oral Torah. So let's get right to it. And I want to share with you, I think, a very fascinating insight. And I want to pick it up with chapter 8, verse 16 or 15. So it's the aftermath of the flood. Noah has survived, he and his family, together, of course, with all of those animals. And now the time has come to leave the ark. Leave the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives with you. It sounds pretty conventional, but Rashi has an astute observation, because when they entered the ark, I just want to say, if anybody's not on mute, perhaps you will mute yourself, because there's some background noise. Okay, thank you. We love your participation, but just if you can make use of that mute button. Rashi observes that when they entered the ark, they were instructed to enter, I'll just tell you where to find it. Turn back to chapter 7, verse 7. V'yavo Noach uvanav, Noach and his sons and his wife and his daughters-in-law, the wives of his sons, with him enter the ark. So Rashi makes the observation. Take a look there in Pasuk Zayin in chapter 7, verse 7. Rashi says, hope you have Rashi's commentary. If not, I'll read it for you. Noach uvanav ha'anashim levad v'haneshim levad. The men in one group and the women in a separate group, because during the time of the flood, they were forbidden in marital relations. During the year, it would be a year altogether that they were in the ark, when the world was going into liquidation, and they floated the company, but they were not allowed to indulge in marital relations, because when the world is in tsar, when the world is in distress, when the world is in chaos, when the world is in cataclysm, it's not appropriate for them to indulge in that kind of personal gratification. Rashi observes now, turning back to chapter 8, or I should say turning ahead where we were before, where we began to chapter 8, there, when they left, Hashem said, leave the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Rashi says, take a quick look at Rashi. Atavi ishtecha, ish v'ishto, man and wife. Kan hitir lehem tashmi shamita. Here, when they left the ark, when the world needs to be rebuilt, so marital relations was permitted to them. Okay, that's great, or so it would seem. Now, here is an astute observation of Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg. So, as we know, they leave the ark. One more observation. Take a look at Pasuk Yud Ches, 2 verses further, verse 18. Vayetze Noach uvanav v'ishto nesheven avito. Noach and his sons, his wife, and the wives of his sons. What happened to the endorsement, even the encouragement, for Noach and his wife and his sons and their wives as family units, as units of man and wife, that Rashi observed, this was allowed for them. But when they actually left the ark, not as Hashem had instructed them, or as I said, encouraged them, but rather in accordance with the way they went into the ark. They went into the ark, men separately, women separately, and Rashi alerted us to the fact that they did so deliberately. Now Hashem says couples, and they're not going as couples. Okay, bear that in mind. Noach builds an altar, and he offers sacrifices. Now look at verse 21. Hashem, and it's no doubt an anthropomorphism, smelled the pleasing aroma. And God said to his heart, Lo osif lekalel odes adama bavura adam. I'm not going to add, meaning in the future, I'm not going to ever again curse the earth because of mankind. Perhaps I need to cut him some slack, as they say in America, because his heart is evil from his youth. He's got a raging Yetzer hara. It may not be within his capacity. Of course, an individual can and should, but mankind collectively, it's inevitable that they're going to become corrupt or degenerate to a degree. So it doesn't pay to destroy the world anymore. And I won't in the future destroy all life as I've done now. Etc., etc. So Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg asks the following. Firstly, he asked later on, but we've observed that first. When they entered the ark, it was men alone and women alone, because no marital relations on the ark. When they left the ark, Hashem told them man and wife together in family units. And the reason is not hard to understand. Firstly, the crisis has ended, and secondly, they need to rebuild the world. But they evidently don't do that. Noach and his sons, his wife, and the daughters-in-law separately. What happened to the encouragement about the marital relations? Furthermore, Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg tells us the following. Take another look at verse 21. God said to his heart, Lo osif lekalel odes adama. I won't curse the earth anymore. And a few words later in the same verse, V'lo osif od lahakos es kol chaim. I won't destroy all life anymore. The Gemara says that a person who says lav twice, he says, I won't do it, I won't do it. Twice, it has the gravity of an oath. If a person just says, I won't do it, it's not an oath yet, but if he says it twice, it's an oath. What's the source? So the Talmud says the source of it is that there is a verse. Actually, Rashi cites it right here, so you don't have to be an expert in the tractate of Shavuot. You can just take a look at Rashi, verse 21. Look with me. I hope you've got Rashi. If not, listen closely. The pasuk says, Lo osif v'lo osif. I won't do it anymore. I won't do it again. Kefel hadavar l'shvua. Rashi says that Hashem repeated it in order to make it into an oath. Hushekasuv asher nishbati me'avor me Noach. Now the verse in Yeshaya, it's in the Haftarah this week, says asher nishbati me'avor me Noach. I took an oath regarding a repetition of the flood of Noah. We read the portion of Noach this week, and you can read it carefully. I'm sure we'll all listen carefully to the Torah reading. We've read it in the past so many times. We don't find anywhere that the Torah says that God took an oath. And yet here in Yeshaya, there's a reference to an oath. So the Talmud, let's just read further in Rashi. Here he repeated it. And that is the Shvua. So have the sages interpreted in Tractate Shavuot. Lo osif, and again, lo osif, that means it's an oath. Now, the interesting thing is that when we look in Masechta Shavuos, we find that the Gemara seems to cite different verses, not these two verses, a different occasion in the context of the flood, where Hashem says it won't happen again, it won't happen again. The weakness with that is that there Hashem just seems to be like informing us of the future. It's a kind of description of what will happen. It's not a declaration. It's not like God is binding himself. He's committing himself not to do it. He doesn't say v'lo osif. Here he says v'lo osif. So Rashi's Girsa, the text that Rashi apparently had in the Talmud, is also found in other sources, the Rif and the Rush. But the way the Talmud appears in our contemporary text, it cites different verses. Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg says the following. Brilliant, I think. The reason that the Mefarshim are not happy with this verse as the source, as Rashi here in his commentary seems to accept it, and as the Rush says it as well, the weakness in it is, take a look again at verse 21. Read it with me closely. God smelt the aroma. And God said to his heart. If God said it in his heart, then he didn't, so to speak, say it out loud, even though it's all an anthropomorphism. But if a person has an intention in his own mind to do something, and he says it twice, or that he's not going to do something, that does not constitute a Shavuot. It may be a commitment he's made to himself, and he probably has a moral obligation to uphold his own commitment to himself. And there might be even a place for Ataras Nadarim. But in halacha, if a person thinks or intends, expresses in his own mind, in his own heart, the intention to do something, that does not create a Shavuot. So probably that's why the other version of the Talmud that quotes the other verses, because there Hashem is actually speaking. Whereas here it says Hashem said it to his heart. So to speak, Hashem is only thinking or expressing the intention to himself. If so, how can we justify what Rashi says here in his understanding of the Talmudic passage that Hashem was speaking? Says Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, I'll tell you what it means. The key is the following. Listen closely. Vayoma Hashem el libo. God said not to his own heart. The Torah here is not telling us what Hashem, so to speak, thought. And he observes that it's actually an unpleasant, crude anthropomorphism to say that God has a heart. It's true that we find that imagery, God's hand and that sort of thing, God's eyes, God's face, it's all just a figure of speech. But even so, to say, Vayomer Hashem el libo, that God said to his heart, it grates on us if we think about it. The meaning is that Hashem spoke to the heart of Noach. L'daber el libo, it means, like the Pasuk says, we have later on, where Shechem abducted Dinah, and then he was trying to woo her, having already assaulted her and raped her, all very unpleasant. Then he wanted to woo her. Vaydaber elev hana'ara. He spoke to her heart. And we have a beautiful passage. We read it a couple of months ago in the Haftarah. Nachamu, nachamu ami. Dabru alev Yerushalayim. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem. The meaning of speaking to a person's heart is words of persuasion, words of, like I said before, to woo her, to words of consolation, divrei ritzui, words of, to reassure or to win the heart. If you say, she won my heart, of course, we all understand what that means. That is the intention, according to Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg over here. It's beautiful how it fits in. When he says, lo osif, lo osif, I won't bring about a flood anymore, Hashem is saying it to Noach. He's not saying it to no one. That's not saying it to himself. He's saying it to Noach. Therefore, the Talmud can adduce a proof from here, because it says in the book of Yeshaya that is, Hashem says that's an oath. So now we know that saying something, I won't do it, saying it twice is an oath. And with this, we can understand, why was he trying to persuade Noach? Why was he talking to his heart? The answer, of course, is, and I hope you're onto it already, we spoke at the beginning of this short shiur, how Hashem said, when you go into the ark, no marital relations. When you leave the ark, go for it. Noach didn't do it. You know why? He was traumatized. He was in shock because of the destruction of the world. And he thought to himself, I'm going to bring more children into the world. My sons are going to father children as well, grandchildren. And then who knows what will be another generation or two, another flood, or who knows what other kind of cataclysm Hashem will bring upon the earth. And just like from Adam until Noach was degradation, we'll have the same thing again. Noach said, I'm not interested. I've lost my drive. I've lost my ardor. I've lost my amor. It's like the therapists say, if you want to get it together, the most important component is the mind. And he didn't have the mind for it. He was too traumatized. Therefore, Hashem says, therefore, it says, Hashem el libo, Hashem reassured Noach. He said, I'm giving you my assurance. I'm not going to destroy the world again. He wanted Noach to have the security. He wanted him to feel confident and secure and comfortable and relaxed. That is the context which can promote the marital relations that Noach had evidently been unwilling or maybe unable to perform. It fits in beautifully then. When they entered the ark, Hashem said, men alone, women alone. When Hashem says to leave the ark, he says, man and wife, man and wife. When Noach actually does leave the ark, he's just, staying with the guys because his heart is not in it. He's traumatized. Therefore, Hashem promises him, and it says, Vayomer Hashem el libo, not Hashem is speaking to his own heart, Hashem is speaking to the heart of Noach. And to speak to a person's heart is to woo him, is to give him the confidence and the security. I don't want to, venture into territory which is not my ken, because I'm not trained as a therapist in this area, but I know someone who is. And I think that this is a beautiful insight that fits into the psukim, I think, in a very compelling way. And that is the first thought that I'm excited to be sharing with you this evening. Now, for those who pay close attention to the promotion that Ruthie sends out on every Thursday, the name of this shiur is Top of the Food Chain with a question mark. So let's turn just a few verses further into the beginning of chapter 9. So Hashem says that the assurance that in the future there will not be a disruption of the natural order, but rather nature will proceed in accordance with a more like normal plan. I mean, there's plenty of variability, natural disasters, etc., but not on the scale that the flood represented. So let's continue with the beginning of chapter 9. Vayivarech Elokim es Noach ve'es banav. Hashem blessed Noach and his sons. Vayomar lahem pru uravu, be fruitful and multiply, milu haaretz, and fill the world. Okay, that's great, and it's consistent, certain with what we've just discussed. Umorachem, then he adds on, Umorachem v'chitchem yal kol chayas haaretz. Your fear, that is to say, the fear of you, the awe, the sort of intimidation that you project to the rest of the world will be upon all of the animals. Kol chayas haaretz val kol of hashamayim, the birds of the heaven, v'chol asher timos ha'adama, everything that perambulates upon the earth. V'chol degei hayam biyedchem nitana, they're all placed into your hands. In other words, Hashem is giving Noach and his progeny, mankind, the authority to rule over nature and to rule over the animals. Kol remas, let's read the next verse. Kol remas shehu chai, everything that lives, lachem hiya la'achla. Now, Hashem already told us something similar to Adam, but here it says explicitly you can eat them. And many suggest that Adam and Eve and their descendants, until Noach, were not allowed to kill animals for food. Some question whether that really was the case, but there is some Talmudic evidence to suggest that Adam and Eve were not allowed to kill for food. If they found an animal that was mauled or that died naturally, they could eat it. Okay, whether it's healthy is another matter. Obviously, they were not bound by the laws of shechita. But it seems they were not allowed to kill for food. And that is an implication that we see right here, because Hashem tells Noach, all of the animals are under your authority, and they will be for you to eat. Lachem yela achla kiyerek esev nasati lachem eskol. Just as the herbage of the field is yours to eat, carrots and lettuce, if you check it for insects, and celery and all those healthy things you can eat. And you can eat animals as well, just the same way. Then there are some restrictions. You're not allowed to eat, perhaps it means Ever min ha-chai, you're not allowed to eat a limb from a living animal, etc. Okay, those are restrictions that the Torah specified. But the principle is laid out here very clearly. You can eat all the animals. Asks ve-ha-Kabbalah, why is that? Why is it that man is elevated above all the animals and is given permission and the authority that explicitly that he can eat them all? Again, we're not talking here about the laws of kashrut that the Torah will give to the Jewish people later on. This is the essential permission for man to be a carnivore or an omnivore, if you like. Why, he asks, was man given that role? After all, if you think about it from a certain point of view, man is actually inferior to many of the animals. Firstly, not just animals, but even the plant kingdom. Man's creation, again, I don't want to deal needlessly with the biology here, but his creation is comes about in a manner which can be seen as shameful. Again, I don't want to get into the philosophy of it. We're looking at it from a different point of view, as you'll soon see. Man's origins are from a microbiological phenomenon. If you think about it, a sapling is more dignified. Even other plants that are a bulb or a seed that's placed in the ground, it's a bit more dignified. Moreover, in his death, man is much inferior to plants and to trees and to grass. I mean, mown grass is very aromatic, very fragrant, unless you suffer from hay fever. Flowers and all of that. Even a tree that falls, okay, it does decompose and maybe termites will eat it, but it doesn't stink, the way a corpse will. And that's what he says. He makes that observation. Moreover, in the birth of a man, a boy, a girl, an infant, a baby, and mankind is weak, is exceptionally weak and helpless, not only for a few weeks or months, but for years. Even in earlier times, when people matured to perhaps more, or I don't mean in biblical times when you have women giving birth at very young ages. Even 100 years ago, it's very well known that people would get married much earlier. But even so, maybe a child of 6 or 7, you send him out to work in Victorian times. I'm sure that was very common, absolutely. But you can't expect a child of 3 or 2 to be self-sufficient. It's impossible. And yet an animal, even a large animal, we once mentioned a giraffe. I think you can still find it on YouTube. Someone mentioned to me recently, I had mentioned that in a shiur. It's probably still on YouTube. I think in the Cincinnati Zoo, in the early days of YouTube, maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, perhaps, and a video of a giraffe that gave birth. And this little newborn giraffe was on its feet within minutes. And that is true of all animals. It wasn't anything exceptional about that particular giraffe. But animals large and small, within hours, within minutes sometimes, they're able to stand on their own, to perambulate. Within weeks, many animals are able to function. And yet the human species takes, as we said, years and years. We see that, and so the pasuk says, if you don't want to bring a proof from the Cincinnati Zoo or from your own observation, you've got a pasuk: shar o kesev o eis ki yivaled, an ox or a sheep or a goat that is born. So the rabbis say that from here you see that an ox on the day of its birth, okay, it may be called a calf, but it can be called an ox as well. And indeed, it can function within a short period of time. To a great extent, it can eat on its own and etc. So this is again a further reflection of the frailty, the feebleness, the physiological inferiority of man compared to the animals and compared to other forms of life as well. Not only that, but he says even the excrement of a human is much more malodorous. It's much more, the stench is much worse than from other animals. So from all of these biological ways, it's maybe a little bit crude, but you look at man compared to these other forms of life, and you wonder, why is man, as I mentioned in the title, the top of the food chain? We've got 5 minutes left. Let me tell you what he says. He suggests actually that maybe rather than the Torah here explicitly permitting man to eat animals, maybe it should be the other way around. And the Torah goes on to say, you can eat animals, but they can't eat you. If they eat you, then they are liable to the death penalty. Okay, it may sound a bit odd, but this is theologically, man is at the top. And he asks, why should that be? It's a question that he's got an open mind, you see, Rabbi Mecklenburg. He says the following. He makes the observation, and for those who are with us in the shiur this past Shabbos at Kesher in the daytime, he mentions this idea, and he refers to it later on in his commentary now in Parashas Noach. That is to say, he refers us back to what he wrote then, and obviously many of the people who are listening right now were not there. Let me tell you about it. He makes the observation that every component of this world, in its decomposition, it is elevated. When it dies, when it decomposes, when it when it perishes, it is elevated. He says that the minerals, let's say raindrops, rain comes from heaven and it falls to earth, and then it soaks into the earth and it's gone forevermore, or is it? The rain enables the grass and the herbs to grow and the plants to grow. What happens to that grass? It's consumed by Elsie the cow. Now, the minerals, which is the water, or even the soil for that matter, is elevated to a higher form of life, of tzomeach, something which grows. When that which grows is consumed, then it is elevated because it now becomes part of a bal chai, of an animal. So it's elevated from a lower form, which is a plant, to a higher form, which is the Elsie the cow, or Dolly the lamb, or the ewe. And in this sense, he's observed that it's Hashem's intention that the world should not be static. There's a cycle of nature. There's a cycle of cycle of life and of ecology, and the whole world, the environment. It works in a kind of a vastly, marvelously complex system in which everything that decomposes is elevated as a result. Now, the animal is consumed by a person, and that is its elevation. That is its completion. And he says that is the way that the animal achieves its purpose. Now, he makes the very, astute observation. I don't want to state the obvious about him. I keep saying it. In verse 2, look how the word kol appears repeatedly. Kol chayas haaretz, val kol ofa shamayim, v'chol asher timos. Kol means everything, all. V'chol degei hayam b'yadchem nitanu. And you've got to wonder, why do we even need that verse? Because it says in the following verse explicitly, kol ramas asher hu chay lachem yela achla k'erak eseh. So the first verse, verse 2, other than saying that they'll be afraid of you, what is it adding by saying that every bird and everything that creeps? Because it says the same idea. He says like this, Bechol, the word kol, which means everything, can also be understood in the sense of its completion. Like, Vayechul hashamayim va'aretz, we'll say it tomorrow night in Kiddush. Vayechul hashamayim va'aretz. Heaven and earth were completed. They reached their state of completion. Or think about the last words of Koheles, Ecclesiastes. We read it on Shabbos Chol HaMoed. It wasn't that long ago, less than 2 weeks ago. We read it on Shabbos of Chol HaMoed, Sukkos. And remember how the book of Eicha, did I say Eicha, Koheles? The book of Koheles ends. Kizeh Kol HaAdam. Sof davar hakol nishma es Elokim yirah mitzvosav shemar. Fear God, keep His commandments. Kizeh kol ha'adam. This is all of man. It means that's the purpose of man. That's the shleimus. That's the completion of man. So he says as follows: the reason that these lower creatures are given to man for his consumption is because that is their elevation. But there's a very important condition. It's only true if the man or woman, obviously, who consumes that creature, if he himself, in his own soul, if he fulfills his role and his destiny as the crown of creation, if he is the choice of creation, because he cultivates his soul, and he serves God, and he acts in an ethical manner with those around him, then the animal that he consumes is elevated by serving the man. However, if not, if the man is like a vicious animal, like a ferocious creature that roams the earth, then instead of being elevated when the man consumes the animal is actually demoted, because actually, as we said in the first part of this analysis, in so many ways, man is indeed inferior to these creatures. And he says, indeed, the Talmud tells us, Gemara Pesachim, for those who've been learning Daf Yomi, did it about a month ago, I suppose, a bit more. In Pesachim, Daf Mem Tes, a bit more, page 49b, take a look. A person who does not study Torah, asur lechol basar, is not allowed to eat meat. Am haaretz achol lesa asur lechol basar. An ignoramus is not allowed to eat meat, because someone who does not cultivate his soul, someone who does not draw on the gift and the divine spark within himself, which is his soul, then indeed he's not allowed to consume an animal, because he's not doing any favors to the animal. If he is a righteous person, the animal is elevated. Now, this idea is found in the Kabbalistic literature. It's found in the writings of the Arizal. We've mentioned it in the past because I have come across it in the Chida or Achaim, but here, although Rabbi Mecklenburg was familiar with the writings of the Ari and with the Zohar, he doesn't come at it from a Kabbalistic standpoint per se, to say it's mystical and this is the animal is a Gilgul, a reincarnation of a person, and this is its completion. It doesn't come at it from that point of view. He looks at it from a moral point of view. God has created all of the universe. And here in our Parasha of Noach, Hashem says to Noach, you can eat the animals. He asked why. In so many ways that we've observed, the animals are superior to man, and man is the worst of the creatures. He's the least of them. The answer is that everything is elevated. That's the intention. When it decomposes, when it dies, it's elevated. And that is true for an animal as well. When a man eats an animal, the animal reaches its shleimus. But that's with the condition that the person is really better than an animal. And he quotes also the source that says, the Gemara elsewhere says, that a person should imagine the kadosh sharui besoch meyav, that there is like sanctity within him. Like the Pasuk says, B'kir b'cha kadosh. So the real meaning is that Hashem, who is holy, is within the Jewish people. But according to this interpretation, a person who eats meat for the right reason, so he is like the holiness is within him, because the animal has been elevated through his consumption. But indeed, if he is not superior to the animals, then he has no right to eat an animal. According to this novel approach, the idea of the vegetarian it may have some merit. It's like someone that I know was once on a plane and he ordered a kosher meal, which they brought to him. There was a Jewish woman sitting next to him, and she wasn't ordering kosher meal. I think she ordered vegetarian. And she looked at him and she said, are you going to eat that? He said, yeah. He said, it's kosher. She said, well, I don't eat other animals. So he said to her, well, that may be so, but other animals eat other animals. Now, to compare one's, our human being to animals is not something that, is a compliment. But the point is that if a person is not worthy of eating meat, then actually it may be a good idea to avoid it. But the intention, as the Torah tells us here, is that Noach is given permission to eat the animals. And this is why, because a person who is worthy, by eating the animal reaches its fulfillment and its completion in that way. So we've looked at two, I think, quite interesting novel comments. The one we've just explained, I don't need to summarize, we've just explained it, but I'll just briefly review what we started with, and that is that when they left the ark, men separately, women separately, even though they needed to rebuild the world. And according to ve-ha-Kabbalah, they were unwilling or unable to do so. They were traumatized. Noach was traumatized. Hashem comforted Noach. Hashem gave him the assurance that I won't destroy the world anymore, in order to persuade him, to give him the security, to make him feel that there is a purpose and there is a future to mankind, so that he would fulfill the divine instruction, and I would say blessing as well, to fill the world through his relationship with his wife, and obviously his sons the same way. And obviously, it did happen because, as the Torah describes, the generations did unfold from this. So thank you. I'm sorry we've gone over a little bit, but we've looked at two kind of subtle and I think fascinating passages. And I thank you for your joining us tonight. So I wish
Mazel tov to Yael. I think Yael on tonight with the Mazel tov.